Welcome back to Prof E Plays. I'm Prof E, and this is another video in my How to Solo RPG series. Now, quick note, this series is not intended to be in any kind of sequence, so if this is your first video, that's 100% fine. Actually, I think it probably makes sense to start with this one. It is my absolute beginner's guide. So first, let me lay out some of my assumptions. This video is aimed at absolute beginners to solo role-playing games. So my goal is to get rid of all the jargon, provide you with a framework for understanding what a solo role-playing game is, and one method for how you can do it. Now, I'm making the assumption here that you're not interested in making a big money or time investment, so I'm not going to recommend books or anything like that. I'm assuming that you're not someone trying to transition from social RPG to solo RPG. That is, I'm making this video for people who have never touched a tabletop role-playing game. I'm also assuming that you're not trying to transition from some other type of solo game, like solo wargaming or something like that, into solo role-playing. Rather, you've heard of solo role-playing somehow, and want to maybe give it a shot that you have no prior experience that you think is obviously relevant. Now, all that said, I hope that this will still be helpful to people who do actually have some social RPG experience or other solo gaming experience. Now, before we move forward, an important caveat. There is no one true solo role-playing game. There are a number of ways to solo out there. I'm just suggesting one possible easy method of doing it. There are lots of methods that are tweaks of this one and some that are radically different. All to say, if you try what I suggest and you don't like it, there are other options. So more on this will be at the very end. Now, before we get too far into solo role-playing games, let's back up a bit and ask a very basic question. What is a game? I suggest a game has three main components that interact. There are players, who are doing things in the game. There are objectives that players are trying to reach. And finally, there are rules that connect players' actions to their objectives. Now, this structure is true for checkers, true for chess, it's true for football, it's also true for tabletop role-playing games. All right, so what exactly turns a game into a role-playing game? Now, there's a sense in which a tabletop role-playing game, while it shares the same elements as checkers, is a radically different thing. Now, here the big key is that in a role-playing game, players are taking on a role, and sometimes multiple roles. So in effect, you're not playing the game as yourself. You're playing the game through the role of a character. Now, it is worth noting that the word role has two senses, and it's really up to you to decide how much you emphasize each of these senses. So first, a role can mean a function. So at work, my role is to teach students, while others have different roles, whether it be recruiting, tutoring, selling books, cleaning the building. Now, each of us plays a role in moving the university, the one that I work for, right, toward our objectives. Now, similarly, in a role-playing game, each player plays a character that has a particular skill set that generally emphasizes some things that other characters may not emphasize. So this specialization means that each character has a purpose, a function, a role in the group. Now, a second meaning of role is thinking of a role in kind of the theatrical sense. That is, you're taking on a persona that is not your own. In the role-playing community, there's a lot of debate about these two senses of the word role and how much we should emphasize each. Now, one of the best parts about solo role-playing games is that you can ignore this debate. Just do what you find fun. So, if you want to explore someone who is very unlike you, great. Emphasize that character role of role-playing. If you want to focus more on the in-game skills and how to use the skills you have to get through various situations, it's also great. It's up to you. So it's worth pointing out that role-playing games do have something in common with fiction writing. Right? Because we are playing a character, we are, in a sense, right, putting someone else into situations where they have to overcome obstacles to obtain objectives. So games involve players, objectives, and rules. And role-playing games involve players taking on roles right, in the specialization or purpose sense, or in the character sense, or some combination of those two. So what about solo role-playing games. Now, this one's simple. It's a role-playing game, but only one player. This one player then has to control the entire world, the main character, any side characters, and everything else, the weather. So let's put it all together. So a solo role-playing game involves a single player playing as one or more characters, trying to achieve objectives according to a set of rules. So, what then do you need? Well, most obviously, you need a player. That's you. A character, some objectives, and some rules. Now, I'm going to suggest we can think of rules in terms of luck and logic. So, the logical system is provided by your brain. So, thinking about the reasonable reactions to what came before. Now, there are a number of Lux systems available. Now, I will present a simple one in this video, which is going to cost you nothing. So, don't get too excited. It's basically a glorified coin flip, but hey, it is quick and easy. So, at this point, we know what a solo RPG is. So we have to start assembling the elements, right? Our character, our objectives, and rules. But to make sure we're really ready, let's get some items first. First, a standard six-sided die like comes with many board games. If you don't have that, don't worry. Just ask Google to roll a die. It will randomly generate a number as if you are rolling a six-sided die. Uh, there are also free die rolling apps you can find on various mobile devices. So check the various stores or what have you. You'll find free ones available. And the second thing you'll want is a random word generator. Now, I'm going to link one in the description. It is literally just randomwordgenerator.com. It will do exactly what we need it to do, assuming that English is your native language. It might possibly have some ability to use other languages. I honestly haven't tried that because English is my native language, and it works for that. Okay. So then the last thing, get a piece of paper or a few pieces of paper and something to write with. Now, alternatively, you can certainly type. I personally prefer paper and either a pencil or a pen. I kind of switch between those two. Now, if you don't have these things yet, pause the video and go get them. All right, so let me first introduce you to a simple Lux system. Now, this is based on the Made Uppy Namey emulator, so feel free to look that up. It is free, but it's a little more complicated than what I'm going to be doing here. So, to use this Lux system, suppose we have a yes or no question we're trying to answer. Or perhaps our character is trying to accomplish a particular task, but success or failure is not certain. So, this also is kind of a yes or no. Do we succeed? Yes or no? Now, in either of these cases, first thing I want you to do is start by thinking about what you think is the most likely thing to happen given the circumstances. Then roll the die. If you roll a 1, then something much worse than the most likely case happens. Now, you need to keep this within reason. You're going to roll a 1 about 16, 17% of the time. So we're not talking about an absolute worst case scenario in most cases. Now, if you roll a 2, then something a little bit worse or a little bit less than the most likely case happens. If you roll a 3 or a 4, whatever you think was most likely, that's what happens. 5 is either a little more or a little bit better than the most likely case, and a 6 is the best reasonably likely outcome. So you can apply this in all kinds of scenarios. For example, suppose my character is searching for a hidden document in an office. My first step is to decide what's the most likely case. So let's say my character is pressed for time, right? So say a guard is going to be checking the office in a few minutes. So at the same time, right, to my favor, we're familiar with this office. I've been here before. I know the person whose office it is well enough to make some reasonable guesses where they put things. So I decide the most likely case is that I will find that document, but that it will be not too long before the guard appears. So I'm not going to have much time to get out after I do. Like, this feels reasonable, and it creates pretty good tension. So that a nice dramatic moment, that's something that I kind of want to have. So I'm going to roll. If I roll a 3 or 4, that's going to be what happens. I find the document with barely enough time to get out. If I roll a 1, something much worse than that happens. For example, maybe I bump into something, right, that makes a noise, attracts the attention, right, of the guards. Or on a 2, something a little bit worse than finding the document happens. Maybe it's just that we don't find the document, but we find something else that gives us a clue about its contents and still lets us get out, at least barely in time. Or maybe we do find the document, but it's water damaged or something like that. Now, on a 3 or 4, what we expect to happen is what happens. That is, we find the document with just enough time to get out. On a 5, things are going to be a little better. We find the document, and not only do we find it, but it is particularly useful for what we're trying to achieve. Right? Or perhaps on a 6, we'll find the document and a stash of related documents. So we get a lot more information than we thought we were going to get. So now, if you're new, solo role-playing games, when a Lux system is used to answer yes or no questions like this one is, right, we often call it an oracle. Sometimes we call it a yes-no oracle. So let's just get you into some of this terminology. So when you hear people talk about an oracle, this is what they're talking about, some way of randomly determining yes or no to answer a question. Now, one last point about this. The die roll that I'm using here works for things that exist on a continuum, where you can have more, so 6 would be the most, 1 would be the least, so where you can exist that way. So very no, no, kind of yes, yes, very yes, that kind of spectrum. Now, if you're just looking for totally random inspiration, rolling a die is probably not going to be very helpful. In that case, that's where I recommend that random word generator. Again, I'll link it in the comments below. Now, in solo RPG parlance, there are a number of descriptors I've heard for random word generators. I've heard some people call them prompts. I've heard one person calls them muses. I kind of like that. I've heard it called a general oracle, also a complex oracle, right? So all of these different names are out there, but really all we're talking about is some type of random word generator. So that is your Lux system. All right, so let's get to work. So your first step is to pick a genre. Doesn't really matter what, as long as it's something you like and are familiar with. Personally, I like sci-fi, particularly of kind of a Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who kind of variety. So something on that kind of space opera, space fantasy side of sci-fi. I like that stuff. I also like fantasy. Now for you, it might be the same, right? Or it might be that you like horror or post-apocalyptic kind of stories. Maybe you like cyberpunk or Regency drama or telenovelas. Picking the genre is a very important first step because it is going to significantly narrow down your options, which, perhaps ironically, makes it way easier to be creative in the later steps. Very few things are harder to deal with than a blank page. By picking the genre first, we replace that blank page with a list of common settings, common character archetypes, common tropes. So that one decision can make everything else easier. Now, for the next step, think about your setting. Now, don't get me wrong, you can start with a character. I often do. However, one problem I've found, and this is also described on the YouTube channel Geek Gamers, right, is that sometimes if you start with a character, you'll immediately hit the wall when you try to start playing. Because a character in a vacuum can end up with nothing to do. However, if we start with building the setting, we can create a world with stuff to do, and then make the character be someone who wants to do that stuff. So, how do we build the setting? Now, I want to suggest two broad methods. One is to start big and then zoom in. But think about the opening crawls in 8 with a 9 Skywalker Saga Star Wars movies. A New Hope begins with it is a time of civil war. Maybe it's a period of civil war, something like that. It's big stuff. Right? Then it gradually narrows down to Princess Leia races home aboard her starship. You can do the same. So think about the broader realities of your world, right? So say we're in a fantasy world. Are there kingdoms? Are there religions? Are there gods that actually do stuff? What races exist? How do all of these things intersect and interact with each other? Then narrow it down to one particular piece, a single kingdom, a single village, a single villainous plot or crisis that's going on. Now, a second option would be to start small. Now, here we can think of things like the opening line of The Hobbit. So, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. We start in a literal hole in the ground. So, imagine a room. What's in the room? Are there objects? Name a few. People? What are they doing? What building is this room in? What community is that building in? And that's enough. You can build from there as you play. There is an important key though. Right? Regardless whether you zoom in or start small, make a world with something you, as the player, want to do in it. So if you want to get involved in a war, make sure there's a war happening, right? Or at least ready to happen, right, in your setting. If you want to delve dungeons, create a world where dungeons are plausible. If you want to go on a piratical adventure, right, make sure you have an ocean where pirates could be. If you want to solve a mystery, have your setting include a mystery worth solving. If you want to explore, make sure there are unexplored areas. This is the point where you create the game's objective. Now, quick tip, don't worry too much about building out your entire setting unless you really enjoy doing that. Instead, it's fine to just build the immediate area where your character is going to start, and you don't need much detail. Let genre conventions fill in the gaps. Is there a well in town? Well, yes, this is a fantasy setting, a reasonably sized town, there's going to be a well. Or, no, this is a space station. Or, yeah, sorta, this is a modern town where every home has running water. So so feel free to simplify, right, by including broad descriptors. Right? It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Does a great deal of heavy lifting. Right? So come up with a few descriptors, a few items, if relevant, a few people. Fill in the details as you need to later on. One more point about this. If you want inspiration or aren't sure about some of the answers, go ahead and use that Lux system. Roll for yes no answers when you have yes no questions, and use a random word generator to fill in descriptors whenever you feel stuck. Even if you don't want to use the result, deciding not to use the result is often enough to get creative flow kick-started. Now that you have a setting, let's build a character. Now here we're keeping it very simple. This is not Dungeons and Dragons character creation, which can literally take an hour or more in some cases. In step 2, you created a setting with something to do that you want to do as a player. Now, make the character who, in the setting, would do that thing. This saves you a lot of trouble. Like, why would this asteroid miner get involved in this interstellar war? Is a question that I frankly don't want to deal with if what I want to do is just fight the war. Right, so my character is going to be a veteran soldier who's called back to do duty, or a captain already on active duty, or a young recruit who just joined the fight. These characters will all have different attitudes, different strengths, different weaknesses. What they all have in common is that they, as characters, want to do the thing that I, as a player, want to do, fight the war. So use that. If you want to solve a mystery, make a character who also wants to solve that mystery. This might be a detective, or something equivalent or genre appropriate, or it might be someone directly involved in the mystery itself, like family members of a missing person, other residents of a building where several murders have occurred. Once you have an idea what role the person plays in the world, then give them one strength and one weakness. Now, in our Lux system, these are going to inform what our expectations are. It's going to be a little bit fuzzy, but that's okay. You might also want to give your character a companion. The YouTuber Man Alone noted in a recent video that without that, solo role-playing games can feel very lonely, which, I mean, technically, yes, you are alone, but people are social animals, and having a companion of some kind in the game, a friend, romantic partner, business associate, mentor, student, whatever, right, helps to connect your main character with the world socially. So let me put the advice this way. Make giving a companion your default. If you don't give your main character a companion, have a good reason for that, and there are certainly the possibility of good reasons. Now, assuming then you decide to provide a companion, think about how much detail you want to put into that companion to start out. If they're going to be really active, it probably helps to give them a strength and a weakness. But it's also fine to discover what these are in play as they become relevant. Now we have everything we need. A genre with conventions that will help fill in the gaps, a setting with a few details in it enough to get started playing the kind of game we want to play, and a character, possibly also a companion, that will play the game through. So, get started. Solo role playing is really just a matter of asking these two questions and answering them repeatedly. How would the character react to the world? And how would the world react to the character? Go back and forth between these, being sure to roll whenever what happens isn't certain. Now, it's often having to figure out the unexpected, right? That is, in fact, the most fun. Now, a few tips and other thoughts. First, When you're first getting started with this type of solo RPG, getting stuck is very, very common. But it really is like training for any activity. You get better as you do it. So, how do you deal with getting stuck? Well, first ask why. Now, to answer this, look at the circumstances of what got you stuck. Were you asking lots of yes no questions and getting no answers? I have totally been there. In that case, it might be time to give the die a break and just do what seems reasonable or seems fun to you. Like, maybe you had resolved one problem and weren't quite sure what would happen next. Right? Well, in that case, use the random word generator. Are you just feeling mentally exhausted and not very creative in that moment? Then maybe solo role playing isn't the best form of entertainment right now. Maybe you'd be better off watching more of my videos instead. Or videos from a better solo role playing game YouTuber. There are plenty of those. Another thing to keep in mind, there is no wrong way to solo RPG. Now, this is something Geek Gamers, one of those better solo role playing game YouTubers I mentioned, says. Everything is play. Now, maybe you just want to develop the setting. Then do that. Maybe you just like making a big cast of characters. Fine, do that. Right? Similarly, if the die comes up with a result that you don't find fun, then change it. Right? Is this cheating? Cheating against whom? All you really have to think about is your own reaction. Now, if you would feel guilty because this is cheating, then just don't do it. Find a way to work through the result as it is. But I find that for myself, I'm not generally tempted to cheat when things are going badly. I kind of want to have awful things happen and then have to work through them. Overcoming obstacles is the fun part, right? So for me, cheating, right, quote unquote, tends to happen when I have an idea I want to go with, but then I generate some random words anyway and just don't like the result as much as what I already had in mind. Well, if I just keep in mind that this random word generator is a tool that's used to inspire, I'll find the real problem was that I misdiagnosed the situation. I didn't need inspiration, so I was generating random words when I really shouldn't have. I already knew what I wanted to do. Right? So don't worry about it when this happens. Right? Finding that balance between relying on logic, right, what our brains are telling us, and luck, what the dice are telling us, is an art. And I don't think anyone gets it 100% right for a simple reason. The right balance changes, right, from player to player, from day to day, and from moment to moment. Now, another point about this, there are a couple of philosophies for how to deal with inspiration in a solo role playing game. So, for example, how do you deal with random words that you generate? Now, some people advocate following your first instinct. That keeps the flow going. Others suggest you should brainstorm various possible interpretations and choose the best one. This naturally takes longer, but gives you an outcome you might like better. Others say to brainstorm a list of possibilities and then number them and roll to determine which is true. Again, it takes time, but it's going to provide you with more surprise. Personally, I think it's helpful to keep these all in mind and then decide in the moment. But if you have a good flow and don't want to break it, stick with your first instinct. If you feel like your first instincts have been really bland, definitely been there, then start brainstorming. So you find something that you don't find boring. Right? Or if things are feeling too predictable, right, try the listing out the options and roll on it method. Also, think about whether you want main character death to be a real possibility. Personally, I love when characters might die. I also love when they do die, but not everybody does love that. And one last tip here. If in doubt, have a villain attack. This immediately is going to create a situation your character has to deal with. Right? What happens next becomes a much heavier question, a much more immediate question. Now, some final notes. This is only one way to solo RPG. Now, the style that I've described is very similar to what you might end up with using tools like Mythic or playing games like Ironsworn. I just boiled it down into a lot simpler form. Now, if what I present here seems overly simplistic, like you want something with a bit more complexity, then seek that out. I'm not going to go into a bunch of options here, but I instead want to mention a few examples of other styles of game. So, for example, there's another style that is more of a choose your own adventure. The Lone Wolf books and Fabled Lands are two series that do this. This removes some of the creative burden from you and lets you really focus on the question of character choice. So, if you're running into troubles on the creative side, giving these a shot might be a good option. Now, there's also another style that involves procedural generation and explicit goals, often in kind of a dungeon delve setup. For example, D100 Dungeon does this. Now, this is great for people who want a game that is much more tactical than narrative, and I definitely sometimes have evenings where that's what I want. Right, so if that is you, take a look at things like 2D6 Dungeon, Carnifalus, or D100 Dungeon. The only one of those I've actually played is D100 Dungeon, and I enjoy it. I also know people who enjoy D100 Dungeon often love these other two. Right? There's another style that is somewhat like what we did in what I described in this video, but a little bit more focused. This would be a journaling game. So 1,000 Year Old Vampires is probably one of the best known of these styles. I haven't played it, but I have played Lichdom, which is also somewhat similar, and I actually recorded the outcome of that game here right on this channel. It's a little bit darker than usual, but no, okay, but it is there, right? So here, what the game does, it provides you with prompts that then you can use to write journal entries to record your story. Uh, Typically, there are also some game elements here as well. So, for example, in Lichdom, some of the prompts are challenges, which you might or might not succeed at based on die rolls and your willingness to expend certain resources in the game. So I think that that gives you a good rundown of one way, a simple way that you can get started from the absolute beginner standpoint of trying a solo role-playing game. And also here gives you a few other options. If for some reason that style doesn't work for you, there are other things out there as well. And so this is Prof E signing off.